Dan Marino might be the athlete that is most known for being ringless. Despite an illustrious Hall of Fame career, despite redefining the quarterback position by the time he was 23, and despite making the playoffs 10 times, Marino only ever played in one Super Bowl and never hoisted the Lombardi Trophy. Because of his 8-10 record in January, he's often referred to as a playoff choker, but therein lies the real question. Is this assessment fair? People who actually know football understand that it's a team sport and that one quarterback can't single-handedly carry a team to glory, and a so-so and very well could if the supporting cast is good enough. This video will take a deep dive into Dan Marino's playoff career to answer the question, is Dan Marino really a playoff choker? While many legendary quarterbacks are tasked with taking over a bottom feeder and turning them into champions, Dan Marino's character concerns caused him to tumble to 27th overall in the 1983 NFL Draft in the Miami Dolphins, who were the defending AFC champions in the strike-shortened 1982. While several of the quarterbacks selected ahead of him would be sent to NFL doormats, Marino inherited an elite defense and Don friggin' Shula as head coach. Marino had a strong rookie year, and combined that with the NFL's #1 defense, Miami went 12-4 and locked down the AFC's 2 seed. Dan Marino's playoff debut would come against the Seattle Seahawks, who boast a strong offense thanks to Steve Largent and the other Kurt Warner, but also went 9-7 this year, have one of the league's worst defenses, and are actually in their maiden playoff voyage, having played and won in their first ever playoff game just last week. Marino's playoff debut was iffy to say the least. He completed 15 of his 25 passes for 193 yards. He threw 2 touchdowns, but he also threw 2 picks, and was extremely lucky that this pass to Mark Duper wasn't a third. This pass to Duper was a 10 out of 10 ball though, and it gave the Dolphins a 13-7 lead. It could have been a 16-7 lead if not for Marino's first pick at the end of the half. The teams exchanged leads in the second half, with Seattle going up 24-20 with 1:52 left. The stage was set for rookie Dan Marino to orchestrate a game-winning drive, but unfortunately, he never got the chance. Miami's Fulton Walker fumbled the ensuing kickoff and conceded possession back to Seattle. Their defense was able to hold the Seahawks to a field goal, but on the kickoff after that, Walker fumbled again, and when Seattle recovered again, Miami had no more timeouts to exhaust, and the game ended right then and there. All in all, the Dolphins turned the ball over 5 times, with 13 of Seattle's 27 points coming off of those turnovers, and it would have been more if they weren't able to just run the clock out after Walker's second fumble. Marino wasn't exactly great in his postseason debut, but I can't say I blame him for the loss when he didn't even get a chance to respond to Seattle's go-ahead score with under 2 minutes left. Regardless, shots weren't being fired at Marino yet. The league knew he'd be back. For my money, given the era, 1984 Dan Marino is the greatest quarterback season of all time. Marino led the league in completions, passing yards, touchdowns, touchdown percentage, yards per attempt, adjusted net yards per attempt, yards per game, and passer rating, while putting on one of the best passing mixtapes I've ever seen. Marino's 48 touchdowns was the most in NFL history, and that would stand for 2 decades until Peyton Manning broke it in 2004. Marino also became the first quarterback in NFL history to throw for 5,000 yards in a season. And remember, this came in the 1980s, when defenders were basically allowed to rip your head off with no consequence. The Dolphins started 11-0 before finishing at a remarkable 14-2, with both of their losses coming in games where their still strong defense gave up 34 and 45 points. Marino and the Dolphins cruised through the AFC playoffs, getting revenge on the Seahawks in the divisional round, and then steamrolling Marino's hometown Pittsburgh Steelers in the AFC Championship. Marino still wasn't amazing against Seattle, throwing 2 more picks, both of them being his fault, but this time he threw 3 touchdowns while completing 21 of 34 passes. Far better efficiency than his previous outing. Against the Steelers, however, Marino was dominant. He threw for 421 yards and 4 touchdowns, both of which were AFC Championship records at the time. Miami rolled to a 45-21 win, and Marino didn't have to throw a single pass in the final 11 minutes of the game. With that, the 23-year-old was heading to his first ever Super Bowl. Marino and the Dolphins were the talk of the town heading into Super Bowl 19. The problem is that they were pitted against Joe Montana and the San Francisco 49ers, one of the greatest teams of all time. They were second in offense, trailing only the Dolphins, while also boasting the league's best defense. This team is Montana, Walsh & Co. at their absolute peak. and would have taken a QB possessed by God to overcome this team. As great as Marino is, he is very much not God, and looked very mortal in the Super Bowl. His touchdown pass to Dan Johnson at the end of the first quarter gave Miami a 10-7 lead, but the 49ers proceeded to score the next 21 points, and Miami never saw the end zone again in a demoralizing 38-16 loss. Dan Marino's final stat line reads 29 for 50, 318 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 picks, for a passer rating of 66.9. That doesn't sound good because it's not, but there is some nuance to consider here. 1. Miami's ground game was completely ineffective, only getting 8 carries for 18 yards. Multiple times, they tried to establish the ground game and were unable to do so, forcing their offense into passing situations, which you could not afford to do against this 49ers defense. 2. Both of Marino's interceptions came when the score was already 38-16, so he basically had no choice but to sling the ball and take some risks. 3. Miami's solid defense surrendered a whopping 537 total yards, 211 of them coming on the ground, so I don't know if any performance from Marino could have gotten Miami to the promised land. Overall, Dan Marino's debut on the NFL's biggest stage was underwhelming, and it officially marked Marino as the prince to Montana's king of the quarterback throne. Once again, the consensus was that Marino would have several more bites of that apple, and this game would serve as a lesson. Little did Dan Marino know, he was never going to make it back. Marino was great again in 1985, leading the league in completions, passing yards, and touchdowns. Miami's defense regressed a bit to 12th in points allowed, but still won their last 7 games to finish 12-4 and earn another first-round bye. This included Dan Marino's magnum opus, where he faced the 12-0 Bears and their legendary defense and handed them their only loss, throwing 3 touchdowns with a passer rating over 100. In the playoffs, things weren't as smooth. Miami eked past the Browns in the divisional round after overcoming a 21-3 deficit. Miami's defense allowed a staggering 251 yards on the ground, but with Cleveland making it a point to take the deep ball away from Marino, he was able to matriculate his way down the field slowly. The Dolphins scored 21 unanswered points via a 13-play drive, a badass run from Ron Davenport, and took the lead after Tony Nathan caught a check down from Marino and yacked his way to a 39-yard gain before a 1-yard touchdown run gave them the lead for good. Marino struggled at first, but woke up once he realized that he needed to throw short to solve Cleveland's defense. Fortunately for Miami, they were going to be hosting the AFC Championship again since the top-seeded LA Raiders fell to the underdog Patriots. The Dolphins seemed destined to cruise to the Super Bowl where the Bears would be waiting for a rematch. Unfortunately for Miami, I think they forgot to show up when it was time to play the Patriots. Miami's run defense got embarrassed again, giving up 255 yards to the likes of Craig James and Robert Weathers. Offensively, Marino had his worst playoff game to date, completing only 20 of his 48 passes for 248 yards with 2 touchdowns and 2 interceptions and a lost fumble for a passer rating of only 54.9. Both of Marino's interceptions were thrown inside the Patriot 30-yard line, drives that could have cut the deficit, and the fumble was at his own 37 in a 10-7 ball game in the second quarter, which the Patriots would then turn into a touchdown. Miami turned the ball over 6 times against New England and were dominated in time of possession in a crushing 31-14 loss. For the first time in my opinion, there is truly no defending this performance from Marino. His defense did him no favors, but highlights from him were few and far between. Heck, their only touchdown in the second half came off a New England fumble on a punt, which gave Miami the ball at the Patriot 10-yard line. Unlike his Super Bowl loss to the Niners, where I don't know if there's anything he could have done, a vintage Marino performance here, and there's a real chance the Dolphins are back in the Super Bowl, where in my opinion, they probably would have won. Instead, this loss marked the end of the golden age of Miami Dolphins football. Dan Marino wouldn't play in another playoff game for 4 years. Despite continuing to put up strong numbers, his defenses regressed even further from average to among the league's worst. The Dolphins put up the league's 3rd worst defense in 1986 and the 5th worst in 1988. The season in between, they were a bad but not horrific 16th, but Marino missed 3 games due to the strike. The Dolphins lost 2 of those games and missed the playoffs with an 8-7 record. The 1989 team started 7-4, but lost 4 of their last 5 while giving up almost 28 points a game during that stretch, to tumble to 8-8 and out of the playoff picture. Heading into the 1990s, Dan Marino was a 29-year-old quarterback, and the Dolphins were showing no signs of building him the adequate supporting cast necessary to make it back to the Super Bowl. Thankfully for Marino, the 1990 Dolphins finally scraped together a good defense, finishing 4th in the NFL in points allowed. Statistically, Marino had dipped a bit from all-time great to just good, but for the first time in what felt like ages, he was able to lean on a defense that was able to sometimes leave points off the scoreboard. Miami finished 12-4 and earned a wild-card spot in the playoffs. In their first playoff game against the Kansas City Chiefs, Marino and friends trailed 16-3 with under 7 minutes left. Marino then led a touchdown drive that included this gorgeous pass to Mark Clayton to cut the deficit to 6. Miami linebacker E.J. Jr. then perfectly read a screen pass that should have been a pick 6, but he dropped the ball, so Marino was instead sent back on the field inside his own 15. Marino led the Dolphins down the field, and at the Kansas City 12-yard line, Marino threw a perfect, and I mean perfect, pass to Mark Clayton for the score and to give Miami the lead. Seriously, if this ball is thrown like a couple inches inside, it's probably picked. The Dolphins' defense, however, couldn't stop Christian Okoye and Steve DeBerg, who worked their way to the Miami 34, and the Chiefs sent out Nick Larry to attempt the game-winning field goal. Thankfully for the Dolphins, the Chiefs and field goals are not friends.
His most pressure-packed kick ever is just short.
Dan Marino's first playoff win in 5 years sent the Dolphins to the divisional round to take on a new challenger, another member of the 1983 quarterback class in Jim Kelly and the mighty Buffalo Bills. Long story short, Miami's defense went into the ice-cold elements and were completely disassembled by Buffalo's K-Gun offense. They gave up 27 points in the first half before Marino and the offense were able to lead a valiant comeback attempt that saw the deficit be cut to 3 points, but the Bills scored 2 consecutive touchdowns and that was the end of it. Marino honestly didn't play bad, throwing for 323 yards, 3 touchdowns, and even ran for one on a pretty sick bootleg, and his team scored 33 points, but they just had no chance against a Buffalo team that was about to hang 51 freaking points on the Raiders the following week. Marino did throw 2 picks, but the first one hit Mark Clayton right in the chest, and on the second one, he threw it directly to Buffalo's Mark Kelso, but it was a 3rd and long at their own 12-yard line, so you could possibly justify it as an arm punt. Either way, Miami was probably never going to walk into Buffalo and win that game, but hey, that's what next year's are for, and if the Dolphins can avoid the Bills from here on out, anything is possible, right? The Dolphins missed the playoffs in 1991, but returned in 92 with an 11-5 record. Marino led the league in passing yards again, and their defense was able to sit at slightly above average, ranked 11th in points allowed. The Dolphins actually won the division via tiebreaker over the Bills and got a first-round bye, and in their playoff opener, they throttled the San Diego Chargers 31-0. Marino was excellent, throwing 3 touchdowns with a passer rating over 100. Miami's defense forced 4 interceptions of San Diego's Stan Humphries and held him to a passer rating of 11.6. Dan Marino was going to the AFC Championship for the first time in 7 years. Flying high, Miami welcomed the Buffalo Bills to a rematch for a trip to the Super Bowl, this time in sunny Florida. This is also Jim Kelly's first game back since an injury he suffered in Week 17 against the Oilers, which required backup Frank Reich to step in against those same Oilers the next week in the playoffs and orchestrate the greatest comeback in NFL history. In Miami's best chance to make it back to the Super Bowl, they turned the ball over 5 times. Down 10-3, a Marino screen pass was picked off by defensive lineman Phil Hansen, and the Dolphins didn't score again until there was less than 8 minutes to play, and after Buffalo had already scored 19 straight points. Marino struggled in the loss, bearing the weight of Miami's entire offense. The Dolphins, obviously a group accustomed to warm weather, felt like they were at a severe disadvantage when they went to the freezing cold of Buffalo, and in the rematch, they were somehow able to get them again in their own house, and they blew it. 1993 would be a lost season for Marino as he tore his Achilles in Week 6 against the Browns and would be MIA until 94. However, that didn't stop Scott Mitchell from stepping into the starting role and leading Miami to a 9-2 record, but they prolapsed from there and became the first and only team in NFL history to miss the playoffs despite a 9-2 start. They were back in the dance in 94 though after a 10-6 finish and 30 touchdown passes from Marino. A 1,200-yard season from receiver Irving Fryer didn't hurt either. As the number 3 seed in the AFC, Marino & co. got another playoff victory over the Chiefs in Joe Montana's final game. Marino was excellent in the win, completing 22 of his 29 passes for 257 yards and 2 touchdowns, and a passer rating of 125 against the NFL's 7th-ranked defense. 1994 was starting to feel like a special year. Buffalo's reign on the AFC has come to an end, and if Miami can knock off the 11-5 Chargers, still quarterbacked by Stan Humphries, they'll take on the Steelers in the AFC Championship, who have a mediocre offense. This has to be the year. In San Diego, Marino would have another strong outing, throwing for 262 yards and 3 touchdowns with no turnovers, and would have another triple-digit passer rating. Against a Junior Seau defense too? Not too shabby. Marino's 3rd touchdown pass put the Dolphins up 21-6 late in the first half. But Miami's porous run defense let San Diego's Natron Means run wild, accumulating 139 yards on the ground, including this 24-yard touchdown in the 3rd quarter that should have been stopped short of the goal line to cut the lead to 6. Marino then had a 3rd down pass swatted at the line of scrimmage, and on the next possession, a tough catch by Irving Fryer on 3rd and 5 was ruled to be a yard short, and Miami had to punt again. It was then the Chargers' turn to get jobbed when this catch by Shawn Jefferson was somehow ruled out of bounds. The Dolphins then picked Humphries off on the next play and took over with 4:24 to go. On the first play, Irving Fryer got open downfield, but Marino put too much juice on the ball. On 3rd down, a Charger blitz got to Marino and he had to throw it away. Miami's defense couldn't hold the line any longer and conceded the lead following this touchdown pass to Mark Say with 35 seconds left. Marino would be sent back on the field, actually in solid field position at their own 38-yard line because for some reason, San Diego elected for a squib kick despite the Dolphins having all 3 timeouts. They wouldn't need them though. On 2nd down, Marino threw a perfect pass to receiver Scott Miller, who let the ball go right through his hands, but was bailed out courtesy of a defensive pass interference penalty that put the ball in the Charger 30. Marino's next pass careened high in the air and was nearly intercepted. His next pass was a kill shot intended for Mike Williams. A perfect throw here is likely a game-sealing touchdown, but once again, just a little too much oomph on the ball, but none of that seemed to matter. Right after, the Dolphins sent out Pete Stoyanovich for a 48-yard field goal try. This kick will decide the game one way or another. One will have a date with Pittsburgh in the AFC Championship, and one will be sent packing. In 1995, the Dolphins started 4-0 before proceeding to lose 6 of their next 8 games, 2 of which weren't started by Marino, but Bernie Kosar. The Dolphins finished a meek 9-7 and drew the Bills once again in the playoffs, this time in the first round, where the thing that always happens again. Buffalo ran for, wait for it, 341 yards and exploded to a 27-0 lead before the Dolphins tacked on some garbage time points. Marino threw 64 passes on that day, but 3 of them were intercepted and Miami was predictably sent packing 37-22. That would be the last game Don Shula ever coached, as the all-time wins leader in NFL history finally decided to call it a career after 25 years of running the show in Miami. Heading into the final chapter of Dan Marino's career, the Dolphins decided to go for another coaching legend, former Dallas Cowboy Jimmy Johnson, who was on a mission to prove that he didn't need Jerry Jones's expertise in order to win all of those Super Bowls. 9 years after leading the University of Miami to a national championship, he was tasked with leading the Dolphins to glory, and in his first year in the saddle, they went 8-8. Dan Marino had spent basically his entire career in the top 3 in pass attempts each season, and in an attempt to take some of the workload off of the 35-year-old, the Dolphins had an offense that was roughly league average. The very next year... Oh, right back to first. Go figure. Statistically, the 1997 Dolphins are almost a splitting image of their 96 selves, so much so that it's kinda creepy. Unlike the 96 team, though, Miami was able to squeak out that extra win necessary to get back into the playoffs as the 6th seed. In another postseason bout with an old foe in the Patriots, Marino was... awful. Only 17 completions on 43 attempts, 2 picks, a lost fumble, only 141 yards passing with a rating of 29.3. To be fair though, the Dolphins still had done nothing to complement Marino on offense. The two-headed monster of Bernie Parmalee and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar could only muster 38 yards on the ground. Dolphins lose 17-3, and it seems like Marino is destined to go his entire career without hoisting the Lombardi. This inevitability didn't stop him from making 2 more playoff voyages in his final 2 seasons, though. The 98 Dolphins were unspectacular on offense, as Marino's abilities were clearly starting to fade, but the team still finished 10-6 after their defense exploded to number 1 in the NFL out of absolutely nowhere, and with the newfound ability to actually keep points off the scoreboard, the Dolphins waltzed into the playoffs for a date with... Round 4 with the Bills would actually provide an interesting contest. Marino was unspectacular, but far better than his previous playoff outing, and when he threw this touchdown pass to Lamar Thomas, he gave Miami a 24-14 lead with under 4 minutes left and seemingly put the game away. But of course, Buffalo quickly tacked on a field goal, then recovered an onside kick with 1:36 to go. Doug Flutie drove the Bills all the way to Miami's 5-yard line before Trace Armstrong came in with the forced fumble and subsequent recovery by Miami. Finally, the defense rose to the occasion in a big moment, and finally, Marino got past the Bills. Took him long enough. And now, riding all the momentum in the world, the Dolphins were ready to march on to the divisional round. 3 wins away from glory. Could this ragtag group finally lead Miami to the promised land? And no. Miami was predictably pounded into the dust by the eventual Super Bowl champion Broncos. Marino honestly didn't even play that bad. He completed 26 of his 37 passes and didn't throw one of his 2 interceptions until his team was already down 24-3. The Dolphins had no answer for Terrell Davis, who ran for 199 yards, but to be fair, neither did anyone else. Miami's not-so-mighty ground attack, on the other hand, continued to be completely ineffective. Dan Marino finally appeared cooked in 1999, dealing with an array of injuries, throwing more interceptions than touchdowns, and going a measly 5-6 in the 11 games he played, but the Dolphins won 4 of the 5 games quarterbacked by Damon Heward, and another 9-7 record was just enough to weasel back into the playoffs in Marino's swan song season. His final playoff win would come against his first ever playoff opponent in the Seahawks. Trailing by 4 in the 4th quarter, Marino led one last game-winning drive, capped off by a 2-yard touchdown run by J.J. Johnson to give the Dolphins a 20-17 victory. Marino was so-so statistically, but expecting greatness from him at this stage of his career would be foolish. Regardless, it didn't stop Dolphins fans from dreaming of a storybook ending where Marino goes out a champion and finally brings home a Lombardi trophy like John Elway did. Instead, the final playoff game of Dan Marino's career just might be the most humiliating playoff loss of all time. Expecting Marino to go on the road and take down the 14-2 Jacksonville Jaguars is a borderline impossible task, but he and the Dolphins decided to do you one better and get throttled into nothingness by a franchise that was only 4 years old. The score was 24-0. After the first quarter, Jacksonville scored a touchdown on their opening drive, and Marino's first pass was intercepted by Aaron Beasley. After taking a 10-0 lead, Miami decided to run back the bit one more time and let Fred Taylor rumble for a 90-yard touchdown. The very next play, strip sack, another touchdown. The Jaguars pulled their quarterback with 11:45 left in the first half. It was 38-0. The final touchdown pass of Dan Marino's career was to Aronde Gadsden to cut the deficit to 34. After Jacksonville took a 48-7 lead, Marino's time on the football field finally came to an end when he was mercifully pulled from the game. Marino's stats were putrid, but at this point, who cares? The final score, 62-7. The biggest blowout in a playoff game in 59 years, and the second biggest in any playoff game ever, only matched by a game from before World War II. Jimmy Johnson resigned as coach the next day, and less than 2 months later, Marino would follow suit with his retirement, ending his illustrious football career. So, with all of that in mind, what do we make of all this? Dan Marino played in 18 playoff games, enough for a wee bit more than a season's worth of sample size. In those games, Marino completed 56% of his passes, threw 32 touchdowns and 24 interceptions, a total of 4,510 yards, and a passer rating of 77.1. He had an average of about 250 yards per game, and if you disregard his runs with Jimmy Johnson where he was a battered and broken old man with half an Achilles, the stats marginally improve. Statistically speaking, these stats aren't too shabby for this era of football. In today's lens, they don't sound too good, but for the 1980s, they hold up fairly well. When compared to the other great passers of the 80s and 90s, he's comparable to many other quarterbacks that did win Super Bowls. He wasn't Joe Montana, because nobody was, but the closest companion here is John Elway, but he managed to snag a pair of rings at the end of his career when Denver was able to build a powerhouse led by Terrell Davis. With that being said, do I think Dan Marino is a playoff choker? The short answer, no. The long answer, the NFL isn't a QB 1v1, it's a team sport. The number one culprit for Marino never winning a Super Bowl is simple: the ground game, on both ends. Miami's run defenses in Marino's playoff games were disastrous. They only held 4 of their 18 opponents to under 100 yards on the ground. Their opponents ran for a staggering 162 yards a game. To contextualize how ridiculous that is, the highest yards per game total by a running back in NFL history is 1973 O.J. Simpson at 143.1. This would be the part of the video where I draw a comparison to a running back season that averaged something in the ballpark of 162 yards a game, but there literally isn't one. So think of it like this: Miami's defenses made the opposing rushing attacks look like 1973 O.J. Simpson if he broke off an extra 20-yard carry every game. That's how bad they were. Miami's rushing offenses were no good either. They averaged only 84 yards a game, and their 8 worst performances all resulted in losses. Their best rushing performance in a loss was Marino's first ever playoff game against Seattle in 1983, where they rushed for 128 yards only for Fulton Walker to fumble the game away. Their worst performance in a win was over Cleveland in 1985, when they immediately dug themselves a 21-3 hole and asked Marino to pretty much single-handedly dig them out of it, which he did. The Dolphins' philosophy in this era was to ask Dan Marino to win as a one-man army, which on the football field is doomed to fail. Dan Marino's best realistic chances to win a Super Bowl were in 1984 and 85. The 84 Dolphins have one of the most dominant offenses in NFL history, and actually ran the ball pretty well in the playoffs, but ran into the 49ers in the Super Bowl, one of the most dominant teams in NFL history. If you ask me, I think this team hoists the Lombardi in quite a few seasons of this era. The 85 team was built to topple the Bears, as they showed in the regular season, but the whole team, as well as Marino, didn't show up against the Patriots. After that, the only Dolphin teams in this era that I think could have made it all the way in a perfect world were in 93 and 94. The former run was cut short via Marino's torn Achilles, and the latter was cut short by a missed field goal, although had they managed to get to the Super Bowl that year, the 49ers probably would have crushed them again. Other than that, the Dan Marino era in Miami was plagued by luck, timing, and muscle. You almost always need all 3 traits to hoist the Lombardi, and those Dolphins teams always lacked at least one of them. Now, Marino does not have a spotless postseason resume. He was a part of that team-wide meltdown in 85, and I really can't say he had a playoff loss in which he was fantastic. But what I can say is that he was borderline set up to fail on many of those Dolphin teams. He had some decent receivers to throw to, but none of them were Jerry Rice. He could only dream dream of having a running back as otherworldly as Walter Payton or Terrell Davis. He'd be insane to expect a defense as dominant as the '85 Bears, but a lot of his units just lie down and died the minute the game started. With this incompetence from a roster building perspective in mind, should it come as a surprise that Miami's last playoff win to date came the season after Marino retired? That's right, the Dolphins haven't won a playoff game in 24 years, and I don't anticipate that drought coming to an end anytime soon. But even though Dan Marino's career came and went without a Super Bowl ring, that shouldn't take away from his legacy. None of that should take away from the allure that was watching him throw a football. His wicked release, his rocket launcher of an arm, his pinpoint accuracy, or his unreal pocket presence. That is how history should remember Dan Marino. Not as a playoff choker, but maybe as the greatest pure passer the NFL has ever seen.